So far in this presentation, we have talked about the evidence we have for the life of Jesus demonstrates that history and theology are so intertwined that it becomes impossible to fully tell when we are dealing with one and when we are dealing with the other. This is true because early believers did not care, as 21st century Westerns do, as Robert is beautifully telling us in the back. We Westerners care with obsessive zeal about what actually happened. What our ancient ancestors in the faith cared about was the meaning of what happened. As a result of that, the Gospels are much more theological than they are historical. Scholars try to mine the Gospels to see if they contain historical information within them. And as we're going to see today and tomorrow, most efforts have been disastrous in this regard. The question is, what is the relationship between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith? When scholars talk about the Jesus of history, they mean the flesh and blood historical human being named Jesus who walked around on earth doing things that could have been filmed if ancient first century persons had access to camera technology. By contrast, when scholars talk about the Christ of faith, they mean what Jesus has become theologically, whether real or imagined, for the community. The question is, does history correspond with theology? And does it matter? Do they need to correspond? The quest for the historical Jesus. The question, what is the relation of the Jesus of history with the Christ of faith? Is there discontinuity or continuity between the two? The problem, given the nature of our sources, historical data that is unvarnished by theological reworking is extremely hard to come by. The Gospels are not biographies of the earthly Jesus, but theological portraits expressing his meaning. How then are we to go about answering the historical questions? Given what we have covered so far, some people in this room may be skeptical whether or not acquiring historical information is even possible. Who shot JFK? After all, we don't know. We're not metaphysically certain about who shot John F. Kennedy. Also, it's extremely difficult to figure out exactly who Abraham Lincoln was. The problem we are dealing with here is nothing new, therefore, and it is not exclusive to the subject of Jesus. As we go along, you should see this more clearly. Again, the Gospels are not biographies of the earthly Jesus. They are theological statements crouched in a framework that is heavily theological in orientation. So what we need to do is explore a story with 5 chapters. And the very end of this presentation, which we have reached, covers the first part of that story. We're going to do chapter 1 right now. We're going to learn the story of the first quest for the historical Jesus. Okay? We begin before the year 1778. That's why I had the music on as we were eating breakfast. Prior to that time, after the Reformation, Christian people assumed that the Jesus of history equaled the Christ of faith. Nobody doubted that. That is to say, they were unaware of the fact that the Gospels, people, Christians, were unaware of the fact that the Gospels we have, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are not biographies. These folks thought that if you read it in the Gospels, you read what happened in history.
Right.
There was a straightforward equivalence between the two. And I'm sure there are people in this room that thought that before entering this room.
How did they deal with the discrepancies? They
Well,
ignored them.
They either Jesus did it twice or something like that. And many of them, the earliest fathers, allegorized the stories because they had no problem that it was not all fact. But later on, especially after the Reformation time, especially after the Enlightenment, right then at that point, well, truth is fact and fact is true. That if it's not factual, it's not truthful. We suddenly bought into that understanding. And that's how Western world was after that point. You understand our personality changed as a cultural personality. It's from those times that our individualism comes and introspective thinking comes. And some of the stuff Arthur Kleinman talks about comes. The result of this was there was no problem. Also, how many people actually sat down and read the Gospels, Mary, and like we've done today? By having one text here and one text here and one text here. Look at it. Have you ever done that? You who have access to these things? How many of you own Bibles that have notes in it? You know what I'm saying. If you've really read those notes, it shouldn't be surprising you. I shouldn't be giving you anything new. If it's shocking new, you should go home to your own Bible and look at your notes. If it's a New American Bible, the red one, it should be in there. Anyway, so there was no need for any quest for the historical Jesus. That was as simple as just opening up a Bible. By the way, how many people were literate before the Enlightenment period? To learn about the Jesus of history, one need only pick up a gospel and read it. This was the situation among most post-Reformation Christians until 1778. Hermann Samuel Reimarus, a German philosopher, had written a book giving an historical analysis of the life of Jesus. The title was On the Intention of Jesus and His Teaching. The book was published by Gotthold Lessing in 1778, 10 years after Reimarus' death. Folks, had Reimarus published this work during his lifetime, he would have almost certainly received death threats. In the book, Reimarus argues that the resurrection did not occur. The disciples stole the body and fabricated the whole story. In 1778, such an opinion was not a wise thing to say in public, was it? Reimarus was the very first person to raise the question whether or not the Gospels are historical in our Western post-Enlightenment sense of the term. What he did was, he used the new tools that were coming out of the Enlightenment and dared to apply them to sacred writ. And after this work was published, there began to be heard throughout the academic world slowly but surely whispers about whether or not Reimarus was correct. And now we have a problem. David F. Strauss, another German and professor of theology at the University of Tübingen, where Cardinal Ratzinger was, published his analysis in 1846, the very next writing. Look how many years passed. The Life of Jesus Critically Examined. Note the date, 68 years after Reimarus' book was published. It had taken that long for anyone again to be willing to dare to go public with this issue. In his work, Strauss argued that all supernatural events in the life of Jesus should be understood as, Bridget? Myth. Which of course now is being understood not as a story that will always be true, but never happened, the ancient understanding of myth, but now as false fairy tale. Strauss coined the terms Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. So now the Gospels could be understood as theology books and not as history books. They could no longer be read as simple accounts of what happened. The Christ of theology could no longer be assumed to be equal to the Jesus of history. With that, all of a sudden, a quest for the historical Jesus became interesting. Scholars dived into the quest. The big academic scholars in the mid-19th century began to write biographies of Jesus. Note, they were not writing theologies of Jesus like Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. They were rather writing biographies of Jesus. These scholars believed that this quest was necessary. They believed that it was possible, and so they went to work. But by 1906, the entire effort came crashing down. What destroyed the quest for the historical Jesus? Three things. Form criticism was the first thing. A method of criticism for determining the sources and historicity of biblical writings through analyses of the writings in terms of ancient literary forms. Basically tells you, form criticism asks the question, what kind of writing is this? Is it myth? Is it legend? Is it, epic? Is it a psalm? Is it a gospel? One can reconstruct from the Gospels only what the church proclaimed about Jesus, but not Jesus as he actually lived and acted. That's one of the things form criticism showed. What form criticism revealed? None of the Gospels can be used as a biography of Jesus. They are faith proclamations of the early church. Some have argued that the real Christ is the Christ of preaching. The second thing that spelled the death of the quest for the historical Jesus was it's really impractical. Let me ask you, can the Christ of faith, the faith of the church, be built on the constantly shifting sands of historical research? But the main reason that the quest for the historical Jesus was this brilliant man. The publication of what is probably the most famous book ever written in New Testament studies, The Quest for the Historical Jesus by Albert Schweitzer, a French-German theologian, organist, philosopher, and physician who had 4 PhDs. Schweitzer's book was published in German in 1906 and in English in 1910. Schweitzer had 4 PhDs, one in mathematics, one in medicine, one in music, and one in theology. Very easily demonstrated that when a capitalist writes a biography of Jesus, lo and behold, oh my God, Jesus turns out to be a capitalist. When a communist writes a biography of Jesus, it's amazing. It turns out Jesus was a communist. When a feminist writes a biography of Jesus, Jesus is a feminist. Who knew? Historians, in spite of their best efforts, produce so-called Jesus biographies that really were just mirror images of themselves. Idealized autobiographies. So the publication of Schweitzer's book resulted in the end, the death of the first quest. Here's Schweitzer's conclusion. But the truth is, it is not Jesus as historically known, but Jesus as spiritually arisen within man, who is significant for our time and can help it. Not the historical Jesus, look at the bold, but the Spirit which goes forth from him, and in the spirit of men strives for new influence and rule, is that which overcomes the world.
Sounds very Gnostic, though.
What year did he write that book?
1906. And here is the most famous quote in all. You see what he was saying, by the way, ladies and gentlemen? That the historical Jesus doesn't matter. All that matters is the Christ of faith. How many people here agree with that? Show of hands. What the hell did you tell you? You just changed 2 hours ago. You said something completely different. Every time I say this, I do this, it's the same thing. I asked you a question early on, folks. Would it matter if the historical Jesus was working on a scaffold, fell off and bumped his head, and was never crucified but died in an accident, construction accident? And you said, absolutely. All the hands went up. That would matter, would fundamentally change Christianity. Now I ask, so the Jesus of history doesn't matter? All that matters is the Christ of faith? And all the hands go up.
Well, there's certain pillars.
Yeah.
You know, you have to have a certain frame.
Well, hold on, Lennis. Does the Jesus of history matter? Or does he not matter?
Both.
Both?
We have to classify that, I think. We have to.
Let's hear his famous quote. Schweitzer writes, he comes to us as one unknown, without a name, as of old. By the lakeside, he came to those men who knew him not. He speaks to us the same words, follow thou me, and sets us to the tasks which he has to fulfill for our time. He commands. And to those who obey him, whether they be wise or simple, he will reveal himself in the toils, the conflicts, the sufferings, which they shall pass through in his fellowship, and as an ineffable mystery, they shall learn in their own experience of who he is.
Personal relationship.
With that quote, the quest for the historical Jesus, Schweitzer's book ended. And it also, with that quote, ended the actual quest for the historical Jesus. Schweitzer was basically arguing that the historical man, Jesus, does not matter. And you all seem to agree.
Well, that's not
The only thing that The only thing that matters is the Spirit of Jesus, the theological Christ. Whatever the history may have been, Schweitzer believed it was irrecoverable, because every time a biography of Jesus got attempted, we're just really writing an idealized autobiography of ourselves. For Schweitzer, the quest is impossible and unnecessary, for only the Christ of faith matters. The result of this was, folks, that from 1906 all the way until 1953, not a single scholar anywhere in the world attempted to write a biography of Jesus. For almost half a century, the quest for the historical Jesus was dead. Indeed, the first quest, or liberal quest, had died. But in its ashes, a phoenix, an unexpected new quest, was being born. Thanks for watching. Just continue the playlist for the next part of the study. If you have further questions, this is good. They will get addressed, so keep watching. If you found value, please subscribe, like, and share. As always, questions, comments, and criticisms are most welcome. God bless you.